20 euros. That is what started it. Not 20 million, not 20 billion. 20 euros is what Ursula von der Leyen's bureaucrats originally valued free speech at before they added 6 more zeros to the number and handed Elon Musk the single biggest regulatory fine in the history of the Digital Services Act. And instead of writing a check, instead of calling his lawyers, instead of doing what every other billionaire in Silicon Valley has done when Brussels came knocking, Musk did something so calculated, so methodical, and so brutally final that 340 million Europeans woke up one morning and discovered that the platform they had built their careers, their businesses, and their entire digital lives on had simply ceased to exist. Not crashed, not gone offline temporarily, deleted permanently, irreversibly, gone. What you are about to hear is not a story about a fine. It is a story about what happens when the most powerful regulatory machine on Earth picks a fight with the one man on the planet who genuinely does not need it to survive. To understand why Elon Musk did what he did, you have to understand what the European Union actually believed it was doing when it issued that penalty. Because from inside the Berlaymont building in Brussels, this was not a reckless gamble. This was a perfectly executed legal strategy that had worked every single time before, against every single company they had ever targeted, without a single exception. The European Commission did not wake up one morning and decide to fine Elon Musk out of political frustration. This was the product of 26 months of meticulous preparation. A dedicated task force of 140 regulatory officials had been quietly building a case against X since the moment Musk completed his $44 billion acquisition of Twitter in October 2022. They had embedded researchers inside European academic institutions to document platform behavior. They had commissioned independent audits of X's content moderation systems across all 27 member states. They had collected formal complaints from government ministries in France, Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands, all arguing that X had become a direct threat to democratic integrity on the continent. The final dossier that landed on von der Leyen's desk in the autumn of 2025 was 2,470 pages long. It documented 1,340 specific violations of the Digital Services Act spanning a period of 19 consecutive months. It included testimony from 388 independent researchers who claim Musk had systematically blocked their access to platform data in direct violation of EU transparency requirements. It contained evidence of what Brussels classified as coordinated inauthentic behavior on X that had influenced election discourse in 3 separate European countries. And it concluded with a penalty recommendation that would become the match that lit the entire fire: 20 million euros for what the Commission described as deliberate and sustained deceptive practices related to X's verification and content amplification systems. To Ursula von der Leyen, that number felt precise, calibrated, firm enough to send a message, but modest enough to invite negotiation. She had used this exact playbook before, and it had never failed her. When she came after Apple, she started with a targeted finding and escalated pressure incrementally until Tim Cook's team came back to the table. When she pursued Google through a multi-year antitrust campaign, Sundar Pichai's lawyers eventually settled for 8.2 billion euros across 3 separate cases rather than risk an outright operational ban across Europe. When she forced Meta to dismantle and rebuild its entire European data infrastructure, Mark Zuckerberg's team complied because the alternative, losing 450 million of the wealthiest consumers on Earth, was financially unthinkable. This was the foundational assumption that governed everything Brussels did in the months that followed: that no technology company, no matter how large, no matter how defiant its founder, could walk away from the European market. The revenue was too massive. The user base was too valuable. The competitive disadvantage of abandoning Europe while your rivals remained was simply too catastrophic to accept. Von der Leyen had stress-tested this assumption against every conceivable scenario. Her economic advisors had modeled what X would lose if it exited Europe completely. The numbers were staggering: approximately 4.3 billion euros in annual advertising revenue directly tied to European markets, and a user base of 340 million accounts representing some of the most politically engaged, highly educated, and commercially valuable audiences on the platform. European advertisers paid among the highest CPM rates in the world. Losing them would not just hurt X financially, it would structurally damage the platform's attractiveness to global advertisers who use European engagement metrics to justify their spending across X's entire network. The Commission's calculation was therefore simple, and they believed it was unassailable. Musk could complain. Musk could post angry messages about tyranny and censorship. Musk could threaten to leave. But when the actual financial consequences of leaving became real, when the quarterly revenue numbers started collapsing, when his advertisers started calling, he would do what every rational business leader does. He would negotiate, he would compromise, he would comply. What von der Leyen and her entire regulatory apparatus failed to account for was something that had been hiding in plain sight for years inside Musk's own public statements, his documented business decisions, and his repeatedly demonstrated willingness to absorb enormous financial losses in service of positions he believed were fundamentally correct. Elon Musk had purchased X not as a profit-maximizing investment. He had purchased it as an ideological project. He had said this explicitly, repeatedly in interviews, on the platform itself, and in communications with his own team. He believed that X represented something larger than a social media company. He believed it was the closest thing to a genuine global public square that had ever existed. And he believed that surrendering editorial control of that public square to government regulators, any government regulators, represented a threat to something he valued more than 4 billion euros a year. The commission had fined a businessman. They had accidentally declared war on a true believer. And a true believer with $44 billion already spent, no board of directors, no quarterly earnings, calls to survive, and a satellite network covering the entire planet does not respond to fines the way businessmen do. While Brussels spent November 2025 congratulating itself on the precision of its legal strategy, Musk was already 3 months into building something that had no name in any regulatory playbook Europe had ever written. And when it was finally ready, the 20 million euro fine would look like the most catastrophically expensive bureaucratic mistake in the history of the European Union. Because what Musk had been building in secret was not a legal defense. It was not a lobbying campaign. It was not a negotiating position. It was an exit. Total, permanent, and engineered to be completely impossible to reverse. The question that nobody inside the Berlaymont building was asking, the question that should have kept von der Leyen awake at night long before the penalty was ever issued, was devastatingly simple. What do you do when the man you are threatening does not need your market at all and has already decided, months before you delivered your ultimatum, that he is leaving? The message arrived at 3:47 a.m. Brussels time on November 19th, 2025, not through official legal channels, not through the formal diplomatic correspondence systems that the European Commission used to communicate with major technology companies. It arrived as a direct encrypted transmission to the personal devices of 6 senior executives simultaneously, and it contained 4 words that every single one of them had been dreading for months. The words were, "Prepare for total severance." By the time von der Leyen's staff arrived at the Berlaymont building for their morning briefings, Musk's core engineering leadership was already 8 hours into executing the most technically complex and financially devastating corporate withdrawal in the history of the internet. They had not announced anything. They had not filed any legal notices. They had not informed European regulators that anything unusual was happening. They had simply started working quietly, systematically, and with the kind of cold precision that only comes from 7 months of secret preparation. Because that is the detail that Brussels never discovered until it was far too late to matter. Protocol severance, the internal operational codename for X's complete withdrawal from European territory, had not been conceived in response to the 20 million euro fine. It had been conceived in April 2025, 6 full months before the European Commission issued its penalty, at a private meeting between Musk and his most trusted technical advisors at a facility in Austin, Texas, that does not appear on any public corporate registry. Musk had looked at the trajectory of EU regulatory pressure in early 2025 and made a calculation that no other technology CEO had ever been willing to make. He had concluded that Brussels was not interested in compliance. Brussels was interested in control, and the difference between those two things was not negotiable. Compliance meant adjusting your practices to meet legal standards. Control meant surrendering your editorial authority to government officials who would decide what your platform was allowed to say. Musk had watched what the Digital Services Act had done to Meta's European operations. He had watched how Google had restructured its search results across European markets to satisfy regulators who had never written a single line of code in their lives. He had watched the pattern repeat itself across every major American technology platform operating on European soil. And he had made a decision that none of those other CEOs had been willing to make. He decided he would rather lose the market entirely than surrender the principle. So while the European Commission spent 26 months building its legal case, Musk spent 7 months building his exit. The engineering challenge alone was almost incomprehensibly complex. X's infrastructure was not organized by geography in any clean or simple way. European user data was not sitting in neatly labeled servers inside European data centers waiting to be switched off. It was woven through X's global systems in thousands of interlocking connections, shared databases, synchronized content delivery networks, cross-continental advertising systems, and real-time data pipelines that touched every region on Earth simultaneously. Deleting 340 million European accounts without destabilizing the platform for the remaining 650 million users in the rest of the world required an engineering solution that most experts in the field believed was technically impossible to execute cleanly. Musk's team proved them wrong, working in total secrecy across 3 isolated server environments that were physically disconnected from X's main production systems. A team of 34 engineers spent 7 months writing, testing, and refining the deletion protocols that would eventually erase Europe from X's infrastructure entirely. They ran 847 separate simulation tests. They stress tested every edge case. They identified and resolved 2,300 individual technical conflicts between the European deletion process and the global platform's continued operation. When the final simulation ran successfully on November 14, 2025, 5 days before the encrypted activation message was sent, the lead engineer on the project sent Musk a single-line confirmation. It simply said, "Clean separation confirmed." The financial team was executing a parallel operation of equal complexity. X's European business was not a simple revenue line that could be switched off with a single accounting entry. It was a web of 5,200 individual contracts with European advertisers, publishers, content creators, data partners, and infrastructure providers spread across all 27 member states. Unwinding those contracts without triggering catastrophic legal liability required a financial and legal operation that rivaled the complexity of a major corporate merger. The team worked backward from the activation date, calculating exactly which contracts could be terminated under existing force majeure clauses, which required negotiated settlements, and which would need to be bought out entirely to avoid protracted litigation across multiple European jurisdictions. The total cost of clean financial separation was calculated at 1.2 billion euros. Musk approved that number without hesitation. To Brussels, that figure would have seemed like proof that leaving Europe was financially irrational. To Musk, it was simply the price of demonstrating something he considered far more valuable than quarterly revenue. It was the price of proving that European regulatory authority was not absolute, that it rested entirely on the voluntary compliance of the companies it regulated, and that the moment a company decided it was genuinely willing to pay the cost of walking away, the entire edifice of EU digital regulation revealed itself to be exactly what Musk had always believed it was, an elaborate system of threats that only worked on people who were afraid of them. Von der Leyen issued the formal 20 million euro penalty notice on December 1st, 2025. She held a press conference in Brussels where she described it as a landmark moment for digital sovereignty in Europe. She spoke confidently about the rule of law and the EU's unwavering commitment to holding technology platforms accountable, regardless of their size or the wealth of their founders. She fully expected Musk's legal team to make contact within 72 hours to begin the formal response process that European law required. 72 hours passed, then a week, then 2 weeks, nothing. Not a legal filing, not a press statement, not a single communication through any official channel. The silence was not confusion. It was not incompetence. It was the most expensive strategic message Elon Musk had ever sent. And Ursula von der Leyen had no idea how to read it, because while she was waiting for him to respond like a businessman, he had already stopped being one. And what he was about to do to Europe's digital landscape in the weeks that followed would make the deletion of 340 million social media accounts look like the smallest part of a catastrophe that the continent was completely unprepared to survive. On January 2nd, 2026, at precisely 6 a.m. Brussels time, Elon Musk posted a single message to X. No press conference, no legal statement, no corporate communications team carefully managing the language, just a direct, unfiltered announcement to the entire world that landed with the force of a detonation. The message was 11 sentences long, and each one of them was a precise, surgical strike aimed directly at Ursula von der Leyen's regulatory legacy. He stated that X was ceasing all operations across the European Union effective immediately. He stated that this was not a negotiating position. He stated that Brussels had demanded he surrender editorial control of the platform to government-appointed moderators and that he would not do it under any circumstances. He stated that the European Union had made its choice and would now live with the consequences of that choice permanently. Within 6 minutes, the post had been viewed 61 million times. Within 90 minutes, it was the single most shared piece of content in the history of the platform. Within 4 hours, every major newsroom on Earth had abandoned whatever story they were working on and pivoted entirely to covering what was happening in real time. European users flooded the platform in a panic, desperately downloading their data, archiving their posts, and scrambling to copy follower lists and contact information before the deletion protocols activated and erased everything they had built over the years. Journalists who had spent careers building audiences of hundreds of thousands on X suddenly faced the prospect of professional devastation overnight. Politicians who communicated directly with millions of constituents through the platform scrambled to redirect their audiences to alternative channels that did not have a fraction of X's reach or engagement. Small business owners who had built entire customer acquisition systems around X advertising discovered in real time that those systems were about to stop existing. The economic damage began accumulating within hours, and it was far larger than Brussels had ever modeled. But the social media deletion was only the surface layer of what was happening. Simultaneously, and with the same cold precision that had characterized every phase of protocol severance, Starlink began terminating service contracts across European territories in coordinated sequence. Rural communities that had no terrestrial broadband alternatives went dark. Agricultural operations dependent on satellite connectivity for precision farming lost their data links. Remote medical facilities that had installed Starlink terminals as their primary internet infrastructure suddenly found themselves digitally isolated. European governments scrambled to assess the scale of what was happening and discovered immediately that they had no legal mechanism fast enough to stop it. Starlink's operational infrastructure existed outside EU jurisdictional reach. The satellites themselves operated under international frameworks that Brussels had no authority to override unilaterally. Emergency injunctions filed in 3 separate European courts were dismissed within hours because no legal precedent existed for compelling a private satellite operator to continue service provision against its own commercial decision. Von der Leyen called an emergency session of the European Commission on January 3rd. The meeting lasted 9 hours. When it ended, her office released a 4-paragraph statement describing the situation as an unprecedented attack on European digital sovereignty and promising a comprehensive regulatory response within 30 days. Musk read the statement, posted a single laughing emoji in response, and said nothing else. The €20 million fine that had started everything remained completely unpaid. It will almost certainly never be collected because the man who owed it had just demonstrated to every government on Earth that regulatory authority over the digital world belongs not to the institutions that write the laws, but to the individuals who own the infrastructure those laws were written to control. And that is a lesson that will reshape the relationship between government and technology for the next 50 years.